What's up, y'all? I'm Andy Story with Poster Grind, your neighborhood art director that designs movie posters for Hollywood. Today, I'm going to share a little bit of the tools from the trade on how to create a realistic looking neon logo, and then also how to put a subject in front of it and properly light the subject with rim light and other color grading aspects. We're going to learn a ton today. We're going to learn about layer styles. We're going to learn about adjustment layers. We're going to learn how to mask. And most importantly, we're going to learn how to bring it all together with a little bit of atmosphere and smoke to create a final composition. You're going to want to watch from beginning to end because I am pretty sure you're going to elevate your Photoshop skills to the next level if you do so and study this tutorial. So without further ado, let's dive on in.
What?
All right, y'all, get that Photoshop fired on up. Let's get this tutorial cracking. What you're gonna need is a few assets. I picked these assets up over at Envato.com, which happens to be a great resource for professional designers that need commercially licensed stock photography, textures, graphics, sound, video, you name it, they got it, and unlimited downloads with a subscription. And the yearly subscription is around $200, so you can't go wrong there. Plus, if you do use the link below, we get a small commission, which helps keep this channel moving forward. So we appreciate if you use them. These are what you're gonna need. You're gonna need a subject. Today's subject is going to be this girl dressed up in an anime style with a sword. And then we're gonna be dropping the neon lights behind her. And then we may need to use some of this smoke to bring in the atmosphere towards the end, maybe a little bit of this texture, and then maybe we might play with this brick as a background element. I just don't know. We got to see what's going to work and not work. And I know what we need to do is get to work by masking her out. So sit back, relax. If you're new to masking, check out the tutorial that I did recently and you'll learn a bunch there. But for now, sit back, relax, listen to some music while I get this knocked out. All right, you guys, I got her masked out. That's good. Now we need to work on our neon sign, and this is going to be the logo portion, so you can pretty much name it whatever you want to name it. Today, we're naming it neon appropriately. Now, this is something we do in the movie poster business quite a lot, and that is using the Liquify tool. And what I want to do is just create a little bit more of a curve right here so that we have more of that sign that we're going to create showing through in the background. So we're just going to liquify this part of the subject. And the easy way to do that is by turning her into a smart object. And to do that, all you got to do is right click on that layer and go down to convert to smart object. And now she's converted. Now we can go ahead and tweak her. And this is a great way to work non-destructively. So if you were to rasterize it, you wouldn't be able to go back and forth. But with a smart object, we can go back and forth if we make some mistakes. So from here, I'm going up to filter. And then from filter, I'm going to liquify. And that's going to bring us into the liquify area. And you just want to make sure that we are on this little smudge tool. And then you're going to want to have pressure around 50. 51 is what I'm using right now. And then we're going to slowly and methodically go ahead and bring in this area a tad. And you don't want to do too much, too quick. You kind of get the point. And like that, now we're going to have a little bit more background show through appropriately. So hit OK when you're ready. And we have more of a curve, and that's what we wanted. And what we also want is to start working with the neon sign. So I'm just going to hide her by clicking on the eyeball. So she's hidden. And then I'm going to create a new layer by hitting the plus sign down in our layers panel. I'm going to bring that layer up into our art folder. And if you are interested on how to organize your folders professionally, then check out the video I did on how to set up a professional movies poster template. And I go in there and explain the importance of staying organized. Now we have this new layer. I'm going to hit T on the keyboard, and then I'm going up to my character panel, clicking on the color picker and making sure that we're on white. And now I'm going to type out our logo. And from here, I'm going to make it bigger by hitting Command T, holding down the Shift key to make sure that everything stays the same size and not tweaked and look all messed up. So hold down the Shift key, keeps your type properly sized. Otherwise, it gets all funky like that, and that's not going to work. That's just going to look stupid. So now we can go ahead and create an outline. And to do that, all we have to do is double click on our type layer, which brings up our layer styles. And from here, we're just going to go to stroke, and you can go ahead and reset to default. And we're going to make the size 6 pixels, but we need to change the color. And you can change the color to what you're going to be working in for your neon sign. And I'm going to be working in these bright, hot pinks and purples. But this is going to actually represent the inside of the neon. So it's going to be the brightest point of the neon tubing. And that's going to be a very light pink / white. And once you have that color, just hit OK. And you're like, hey, what's going on here? Well, we need to create the outline. And the easiest way to do that is by going up to our fill and dropping the fill all the way down to 0. What we need to do from here is turn this into a smart object so that we can start tweaking with the glow and the glowiness. So I'm going to hit Command J, and I'm going to have that copy, and the copy is what we're going to be working off of. But I want to preserve what we just did, so I'm bringing that layer that we originally created down below our background color adjustment layer. And now it's just going to sit down here in case we ever have to go back down and figure out how we made this thing. Now from this neon copy, I'm going to turn it into a smart object once again. Go ahead and right click and then go to convert to smart object. And now we can start tweaking this. And to do that, we're going back into layer styles by double clicking. Now we're in layer styles. And from here, we're just going to go down to outer glow. And then from outer glow, reset to default. Now the blend mode needs to be changed from screen all the way over to, well, 2 spaces down to linear dodge. And then the opacity can be at 100%. And now we can change the color to what color you're going to be using. And you're going to want to stick to the same hue throughout this process. So we're going to be doing this hot pink color. Fully saturated is going to be to the right. Hit OK. And now we can increase the spread to something around in between 20 and 30%. Let's just start to see what it looks like. All right, I'm just gonna do 22%. And then we can increase the size as well. And this is all subjective, so kind of see what's gonna work for you. So like right there, that's gonna be a little too much, but I feel like something around 29, that looks good. And don't forget the step to convert to smart object that we just did previously. Otherwise, this line won't be centered. It will be either on the outside or the inside. So that's a step you do not want to skip. Now we can just go and mess with the drop shadow, which isn't going to be an actual drop shadow, but rather just more glowy effect within the layer style. So just click on drop shadow and then make sure that we are reset to default. And the first thing we're going to do is change the blending mode back to linear dodge. And then the color, we're going to use the same exact color that we just used, but I'm kind of eyeballing it for tutorial purposes. If you want to stay exact, you could have gotten the color from the outer glow, these numbers right here, and just plug them in, but I'm eyeballing. So I'm just going to hit OK. And now the opacity we can crank up to 100%. And the distance, we're just going to put that at 0 because we're not doing an actual drop shadow. We're just creating glowies or glowy effects. And then the spread is what we want to mess with. So you can kind of see that's going to be, we don't want to do too much. We'll probably do something, I don't know, 13%. And then the sizing, this is the important one. It's just going to start to blow out the color. I'm just going to go with 207. So whatever works for you, just use your eyeball and see what starts to work. But 207 is working in this situation. Now I'm going to hit OK. And from here, actually, this is a step we could have done before, but we'll do it now. We're going to create a duplicate by hitting Command J. So we have a copied layer, but we're going to turn these effects off, and you'll see why. So I'm just turning that off, turning that off. I just want this outline in white. And from here, let's just get rid of these layer styles by clearing layer styles. I've right-clicked on that layer, clear layer styles, and then I'm just going to turn this into a Gaussian blur. So I'm going up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian blur, and let's just do this sequentially. So we'll do this blur at 7, and then we're gonna make another copy, Command J, double click on Gaussian blur, and we're just going to increase this to 40, something in 43 pixels. And I'm gonna do it one more time, Command J, double click Gaussian blur, and I'm just going to increase this to around 117 pixels. Perfect. Now I'm going to go back down to that original layer, which we just tweaked with all the colors, make that visible, but now we're just going to create little gaps so this mimics an actual neon sign. And to do that, we're just going to use a mask. So I'm going to the Japanese flag symbol, creating a mask, and then I'm going to use a brush to put our little breaks in by hitting B. And then I want to make sure I'm painting with black. Make sure that your color over here is on black. You can hit X to toggle between white and black. I'm going with black. And then I'm just going to, the flow doesn't really matter because, well, you can have a stronger flow if you want. But now we're just going to be painting on the mask, and we're just going to paint random blocks in our neon sign. So my flow is increased. So I'm just going to be painting these, and when you paint these in like that, it's going to have the edges be nice and rounded. So just go ahead and pick some spots where you think you would want to see these little breaks. And now you'll see that we still have a little bit of that white blur, those white Gaussian blurs that we just created. And it kind of looks a little funky. So that first one's probably going to be the strongest one. If we can just add that mask that we just created to that layer, I think it's going to solve the problem of making it look a little more realistic. And we can just do that by hitting Option and dragging that mask onto that layer. So Option, holding Option, and then I'm selecting that mask and I'm just dragging it up to that layer. And like that, we have a more realistic situation. It looks pretty good. The one thing to make this look a little more realistic and interesting is we're going to use that same mask that we just created on our main neon layer and just paint away some of the white so that it's a little more nuanced. And so I'm just going to go back to my brush, but I'm going to drop the flow to around 14%. And then I'm just going to start painting with black in certain areas just to kind of make the lighting a little bit less strong around different areas. I don't know how to explain that, but just kind of doing this, I'm sure you might agree, like that might be a little more interesting and make the neon sign a little bit more believable. Even though this is not this whole project is a little more theatrical and it's going to be exaggerated with the coloring and the rim lights, but this part, it just adds a nice little, I don't know, believability to it. And then you can go back if you went a little too strong by painting with white. I definitely don't want to lose a white interior, just want it to be nuanced. There we go. I like what we're seeing. So now we can basically turn this into its own group. So everything that says neon or wherever the type is located, we're going to hold down the Shift key and select all, and then we're going to hit Command G and turn that into a group, and then we can just name this neon sign, like so. I always get carried away when I'm making a tutorial and forget to ask that if you've learned anything up until this point, then by all means hit that like button so that we can help appease the YouTube algorithm. I appreciate it. Now the fun part begins. We can start to add the lighting and coloring effects to our subject, and then we can also bring down that neon sign a little bit and see if it's going to look better. So I'm just clicked on that group, hitting V, the move tool. I'm just gonna move it down like that. And then I'm gonna move our subject in front of the O like that so that we can see these two lines in the O so it's easier to read that sign behind. This photograph of the subject is not going to be the easiest to work with because the lighting is so strong. So we're gonna have to do a lot of tweaking to make this look good. And the first thing we need to do is, since the light is coming from the neon sign, we need to darken her and create a little bit of a shadowing effect. And one of the easiest ways is just using exposure. So I'm going to the adjustment layer, exposure, and then I'm going to use a clipping mask to clip to her by hitting Option Command G. And then from here, I'm going to the exposure properties, and I'm not going to increase the lighting. I'm actually decreasing it. So we're going to decrease the lighting on her. And now on that mask, I'm going to bring the lighting back around her edges by masking out those areas. So now that she's dark, too dark, we need the lighting to come back. So using a black brush with a low flow, I'm just going to paint around her where the light will be hitting her. All right, we have the basics of the rim lighting and the theatrical lighting kind of in place. And from here, we can just go ahead and start adding a little bit of color. And the way I like to do this is by using a solid color adjustment layer. And then from here, we're just going to pick the same color that we're using from the neon sign, obviously. You're gonna wanna invert the mask by hitting Command I. And now we can go ahead and you could use the color picker if you wanted to, but I just want the saturation up all the way. So I've color picked the color and then I'm just bringing the saturation all the way back up. And now we can just start painting in areas where the light's going to be touching her, like we just did with the exposure. So I'm just using a low flow brush and I'm just going to be going in and painting over what we just painted. I'm going to use a clipping mask by hitting Option Command G and clipping that to our subject. And now that's going to clean up the edges and make sure that it only affects her. And now I'm just going to drop the blend mode all the way down to overlay. And you can kind of see we're just going to start building up the light. And then actually with her, I'm going to kind of get an overall color change on her. We should have done this prior, but go to the layer. We're just going to create a layer in between these two, and that's going to be a hue saturation adjustment layer. So go to your adjustment layers, hue saturation, and that's automatically going to create a clipping mask since we're in between these two layers. And we're just going to do a little colorizing. And the easiest way is just to hit colorize on your hue saturation over here. And then we can just start to play with the sliders until we get more of that pink color. And then we can increase the saturation if needed, like that. And then once you're satisfied, go ahead and invert the mask by hitting Command I. And then we're just going to paint that back in, except not too much on her face. All right, looking good. And now speaking of the skin, her face is a little too dark, so we're going to go back to that exposure mask and then paint away a little bit of that mask so that she's a little bit more bright. And you're going to see that a lot of this is just going back and forth on certain elements until you get it right. And you always want to have the eyes be nice and bright when you're doing theatrical projects or graphic design in general. And now that overlay layer is pretty strong, so we're just going to drop that a tad. And then I'm going to paint away her face because it's a little too strong on her face. All right, so it's looking nice and pinky, but it's a little strong. So we're just going to drop the opacity a little bit on that hue saturation and maybe a little bit more on that overlay. And now I just want to get this rim light a little stronger. So we're going to go and add another exposure, but this time we're going to increase the light. So we're just going to bring the exposure up like that. And then we're just going to attach it down here in between the hue saturation and the original exposure. And now I'm going to hit Command I. And then from here, we're just going to paint in a little bit of that rim light one more time by using a brush, hit B for brush, and then hit X and make sure you're painting with white. And then we're just going to go back in and exaggerate these edges. And now we're going to add a curves adjustment layer to increase the contrast. And the easy way to do that is to hit your curves and then just go up here to strong contrast, and it does everything for you, but that's a little too strong. So we're just going to drop the opacity a tad. I'm going to tweak this light is a little too strong, so I'm just going to get rid of that by painting on that mask with black. Now we can start messing around with the colors even more. So I'm going to use new layer, and I'm just going to start painting in some of that pink, but a little bit on the whiter side. And we're just going to add little color blasts to areas. And we're going to use a clipping mask, Option Command G. And then we're going to turn that into a blend mode, back to overlay. And now we can actually use a little Gaussian blur. So I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, blur it out a little bit. So I'm at 4.7 pixels. And then the same thing, new layer. And then we're just going to be painting, and we're going to add more color. Go to your brush, painting color picker, and we're just going to add a little bit of color to it. And we're just going to paint around her. And then we're going to change this blending mode to soft light. And then once again, we can clip this, Option Command G. I think we need to add a little bit more color. So we're going to do solid color adjustment. And then we're going to use that same color we just used, maybe just tone it down into the whites a little bit more. Hit OK. Invert the mask, Command I. And then we're just going to paint on her in these little areas where the light would be a white brush. And now we're going to double click and go to Layer Styles. And then we're going to use a little bit of Blend If by holding down the Option. And then we're going to split these sliders so that it only shows up where our lights are. Maybe we can mess around with the color. I'm double clicking on the color, and then I'm just going to see what happens if we add a little bit more saturation. Option Command G. It's a little strong, so I'm going to drop the opacity like that. And then this highlight on her dress is a little too strong too, so I'm going to take that out. And I'm going to tweak that saturation layer, the colorized saturation, and I'm going to get rid of a little bit of color. It's a little too strong in certain areas. Going in and tweaking certain things that were a little heavy-handed. And then maybe play with the exposure. And I'm going to do one more exposure layer, dropping it. And then we're going to turn that into an inverted mask by hitting Command I. And then we're just going to paint in a little bit more dark using brush, B for brush, X to make sure that we're painting with white. I'm just going to darken up little areas. All right, looking good. Now we're just going to add a little bit of atmospheric lighting. And to do that, we're just going to paint with that same color. And we're just going to add little areas to kind of blend her in. So just go ahead and paint lightly. Just change the blending mode to screen, and then we're going to drop the opacity to, I don't know, around 30% to 20%. And then we're going to do a little one more time, new layer. Just going to paint some atmosphere on top. And we're going to turn this blending mode into an overlay. And then we're just going to drop that down to 32%. And then one more. And we're just going to drop this down to soft light and then drop the opacity. So we're just building up a couple layers of lighting, and that just kind of helps blend everything in and make it a little more realistic. And I'm going to turn that into its own little group by clicking on the layer, holding down Shift, and then we're just going to hit Command G. We're just going to call this glow, and then you can turn it on and off to see what it looks like. And I might actually add a mask to that and then just paint away a little bit of that glow up here on the top using brush and making sure I'm painting with black. Just going to get rid of that. I just want the top of her head to be a little on the darker side, and then maybe a little bit of that skin tone over here to be a little less effective. Now we're just going to do some curves layers, and we're just going to paint back in a little bit of those highlights. So I'm just increasing the curves, and then I'm going to hit Command I, go back in, and then just place a little bit of light in certain areas. Now the lighting on the model doesn't make sense because the shadow shouldn't be here. So you kind of got to tweak it a little bit to make it work for you. So I'm just kind of trying to get rid of a little bit of those shadows and adding a little bit of highlights, some subtle highlights in certain areas. And I'm going to just bring that down and turn that into a clipping mask, Option Command G. And then I'm going to add a little bit of more darkness with the curves, Option Command G. I'm just going to drop that down. And I'm just going to paint that in as well with a inverted mask. So Command I, and I'm just going to paint in some areas where I think it's going to look better dark. All right, we have the tweaking of all the colors and the rim light looking good. Now we just need to add the final effects and tweaking. So I'm going to drag our smoke that we had picked out before and some of that grunge and just put that in our effects folder. And then from here, I actually want to do a little bit of a color adjustment. So I'm going to color balance adjustment layer, and then I'm just going to add a little bit of magenta to the whole thing, maybe a tiny bit of red. And then I'm going to go to highlights, add a little bit to the highlights, a little magenta to the highlights like that. And that's a little strong, so we can just take the opacity down a tad. Cool. And now I'm going to, on this uppermost layer, I have our smoke. I'm going to hit Command T, increase the size. And then I'm going to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and I just want to blur it out a little bit. So at 19 pixels, and I'm going to turn that blending mode to, let's see, to soft light, and then we can actually, so we have that at soft light, and then let's see what happens if we drop it below. So we have a little bit of that smoke at soft light, and that's pretty much tying everything together. And I'm going to add one more layer, a little bit of color to a soft light, and I'm going to drop the opacity. And actually I'm going to go back into our subject, and I just need I feel like her face is a little too bright right here, so I'm going to add a little bit of exposure and just drop it and hit Command I, and then just paint in a little bit darkness right here. There we go. It's just really hard to work with improper lighting on the face, so it takes a lot of tweaking, but you can eventually get there. And then let's just see what happens if we play with levels. So I just dropped the lighting a little bit, and now we can just add one little final thing, Option, and I'm going to hold down Option, hit the plus sign, and we're going to add a little bit of noise. So I'm going to hit N for noise, mode, overlay, fill with overlay neutral, filter, noise, add noise, and we're just going to, I think 7's usually pretty good. And I'm just going to drop the lighting one more time. I'm going to paint away certain areas. This is just like one final step. You can really keep going on this thing until you're satisfied, but I want this to look a little cool. And then I just added a little blast of color and put the blending mode to color on her face. And I think we're looking a lot better. I like where we're at. I hope you guys learned something. You can just keep going on these things for another hour until you get everything right. But the idea is that you guys learn a little something to make a very cool effect with neon lighting and neon in general. So there we go, guys. See you on the next tutorial. Thanks for checking it out.